This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Dan Twining, president of the International Republican Institute. Dr. Twining previously served as counselor to the president and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, and as a member of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's policy planning staff during the George W. Bush administration. Dan Twining joins us today for a discussion on a recent report he co-authored with the McCain Institute's Russia Task Force entitled Post-War Pathway: Principles for U.S.-Russian Relations After Ukraine. This publication sheds light on the outlook for potential post-war strategies for the United States towards Russia. Stay with us as we speak with Dan Twining. Dan Twining, welcome to NatSec Matters.
It's great to be with you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so glad to have you. You're one of the leading lights here in town on all things foreign policy, national security, but in particular, the Ukraine war with Russia. And I thought I might just start with a very general question. I definitely want to get to a document that you contributed to called the Principles for U.S.-Russian Relations After Ukraine. But at the outset, can you give us a brief overview of where the war in Ukraine currently stands? And let's talk about if there have been any other major breakthroughs since you put out your report.
Thanks, Michael. So the main thing to understand after 3.5 years of grinding fight is that Russia has picked up almost no more Ukrainian territory than it initially seized. Russia has suffered north of 1 million battlefield casualties. The Russian economy has been pumped up through wartime command and controls, but the economic outlook is dire. There's a lost generation ahead for Russia, economically and technologically. Russia has severed nearly all of its trading and investment ties with Europe and the West, and has had to pivot to the East, to China, North Korea, etc. So Putin made a terrible strategic mistake in doing what he did. That said, some of the bloodiest nights of the war and days have come since the Alaska summit between President Putin and President Trump, which I think most of us expected, even if we didn't get a deal, that Putin would perhaps de-escalate following the direct engagement of the President of the United States. And in fact, Putin has escalated, not only in Ukraine, some of the bloodiest and most fatality-laden attacks of the whole war have happened over the past few months, but also Europe, where Putin is waging really a hybrid war. I mean, European leaders are now saying we're no longer in a state of peace with Russia. We're in something closer to a state of war than a state of peace with Russia, because Russia's escalated this hybrid campaign of drone activity, seaborne and other activities, severing cables across the NATO theater. So in some ways, Putin is escalating. The U.S.'s attention is focused on the Middle East and some other conflicts, obviously in our own hemisphere with Venezuela. And the Ukrainians have held out as the shield of Europe and the West. And there's some very interesting reporting, including in the Wall Street Journal, about everything that the U.S. military is working with Ukraine to learn about how to conduct modern warfare in an era of drone technology. So the Ukrainians are still in the fight. Putin is not winning, but the Ukrainians are paying a rising and heavy price. And I do think it's time for the U.S. to assert ourselves to try to end this conflict.
All right, we're definitely going to get into that in a second, but you raised this gray zone use of drones and cable cutting and the rest. I mean, what exactly is Putin's aim here? Is it to intimidate Europeans so that they petition their leaders to go soft on Russia? Or tell me your assessment.
I think it's to divide NATO within ourselves, right? Divide Europeans amongst themselves. I don't think Putin believes he could fight or win a war against NATO. He would be crushed. The Russian army is the size of the economy of the Netherlands, right? It's not a serious proposition to actually have a real fight with NATO. But what he can do is use these hybrid tactics to put pressure short of the ceiling of an actual military assault, underneath that ceiling, to create stresses and strains, to raise tensions within the alliance, to use forms of information warfare to agitate European populations, against further assistance to Ukraine. It's quite a remarkable feat, this idea that somehow he's perceived in certain quarters as a man of peace. He's conducting the bloodiest war of aggression in Europe since the Nazis. So Europe has been shocked to its senses. If there's a silver lining, it's that, right? Europeans made a commitment to raise defense spending to 5% within NATO. They are organizing themselves in new ways. They're talking about building a drone wall along the borders of the European Union and NATO with Russia in the east. But Putin's efforts are designed to make us all spend a lot of money defending ourselves and a lot of time and energy worrying without actually having a real fight. And it's frustrating.
Well, we'll get to the Trump administration in a second, but just now that we're on this, I think you and I would probably agree that the president's answer on NATO involvement to, shoot down an incursion of an airplane, or maybe even a drone's less hard to do, but of an airplane, that was kind of significant. I don't know that it surprised me, but I don't know that everyone would have bet on the president to actively and immediately back NATO.
I think you're right. I think Putin's made a strategic miscalculation that his own actions, Russia's own aggressive actions, have hardened the president of the United States' position. President who came to office saying I could do a peace deal really fast with Vladimir Putin. Putin has escalated. I think in some ways he's embarrassed the president by not doing what he said he would do, which is de-escalate and negotiate to end the war. Putin's demands are unchanged from when he started this war. He wants to end Ukraine's existence as a sovereign country. He wants to create a failed state in Ukraine, which will never be able to succeed in developing and prospering. So Putin does not seem chastened, and it makes me wonder, all of us in the West, in Europe and the U.S. who think we've run a really tough wartime policy for 3.5 years, doesn't seem to have had that effect on Putin. He still feels like he has the upper hand, and he somehow controls the flow of escalation. So I know we'll get into it all, but I think there are a lot more economic and financial tools in our armory in particular that we as the West should be deploying to really kneecap Putin and make it impossible for him to continue the war, to put him in a position where he's the one who wants to end it because his economy and his outlook is suffering. And that's the direction that U.S. policy should be headed in.
Dan, can we also just, for my benefit as well, I try to make and articulate a case on why conservatives should support Ukraine and why it's in the interest of the American people. But can you just bring us back to first principles? Why in a world when China is a rising power and seemingly the biggest geopolitical foe that we'll experience for the next several decades, would we spend a lot of time in the old theater of Europe bailing out the Europeans in a conflict that they ought to be sharper on themselves?
So, Michael, you've written very compellingly on this, so I hope people listening will Google you to find a good answer to that question. But basically, China's all in supporting Russia, right? Russia could not have sustained the war for 3.5 years, according not to me, but to the U.S. intelligence community, to the former and current U.S. cabinet secretaries. Russia could not have sustained the war without China's active material support. So it's a great advantage to the Chinese that Putin is tying down American national security energy and resources in Europe. It's also why Iran and North Korea have come in on Russia's side, supporting Russia on the battlefield. These are countries, these are America's enemies that collectively want to cut down American leadership and create a world centered on their authoritarian values and their interests, which are the opposite of the interests of America and the free world that we lead. Look, Michael, our grandparents, in many cases, parachuted or fought their way into Europe because the U.S. had pursued an isolationist policy in the 1930s, where we said what happens over there doesn't matter. If European nations get conquered, who cares, right? We made the same mistake before World War I, had to fight our way in, made the mistake again before World War II, had to fight our way in. Europe has enjoyed 80 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity, and guess what? That's benefited America very directly. Europe is our number one trade and investment partner, right? For all the focus on China and the rise of the East, Europe is America's number one trade and investment partner. The Europeans are huge direct investors in the United States. American companies are hugely exposed to Europe. It's much more expensive for us to be sitting through an active war in Ukraine than it would be to hold the line and uphold the peace of Europe, which is what NATO was doing before the Russian invasion. And we would be a lot more able to concentrate on the grave security challenge we confront in the Pacific with China if Europe were stable and free and at peace, which has been a goal of every American president literally in your and my lifetime. So that's still a worthy goal. Let's get back to that. Europe has certainly a role to play in stepping up and working with us to uphold that peace.
Okay, terrific. All right, now let's get down to business here. Give us an assessment here in early October 2025 on where you think the President of the United States is on Ukraine policy. Where has he been and where do you think he's going?
So I think he's learned a lot, including dealing with Vladimir Putin and understanding that Putin will say charming and gracious things to your face and then stab you in the back and put poison in your cup of coffee when you're not paying attention. I mean, that really is his MO as a former KGB operative. So I think there's been an education there. I also, the president may be right that if he had been president, Putin wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. That didn't happen in the first Trump administration. But it's now President Trump's war to try to end and see to an honorable solution that protects American national security interests. What does not protect American national security interests is having the Russian army fighting its way west towards NATO Europe and running drone and air sorties over NATO airspace, into NATO airspace. So the United States is being very directly challenged by Russia's war of aggression. I think the president increasingly understands that. I think the European allies have actually done a good job in educating him. I mean, like-minded conservative European leaders like Merz in Germany, the new chancellor of Germany, have done a good job educating him. I think the advantage, the president went to this last NATO summit and came back saying, hey, these are our friends and allies, and they're right. We do have an interest in NATO, and we want to support them, and we need to work together to uphold the peace of Europe and end the war. So polling also shows, Michael, as you know, the Reagan Institute summer survey, the Vandenberg Coalition's monthly surveys, they show that Americans overwhelmingly understand that Russia is an adversary of the United States. And very few Americans want Russia to win. I mean, it's in low single digits. Like, no one's rooting for Vladimir Putin in the United States. People are rooting for Ukraine, right? They understand a free people defending itself against a war in a war of aggression, whose side America should be on.
Yeah. So let's take a couple different things here. Let's try to break U.S. assistance into three categories: intelligence, arms, and sanctions/tariffs. It feels like we are at least doing as much as we all ever were on intelligence, and otherwise sharing with the Ukrainians, the newspaper would have us believe, information that would really improve their ability to make long-range strikes. So just before we get to the other two, have you heard anything about the Trump administration limiting the information sharing that we do with them?
I mean, there was a threat of it early on in the early months of the Trump administration, and it may have happened for a period of hours, but I think that was it. And yes, I do think we are and we should be helping the Ukrainians with some of this battlefield awareness that only we can provide. I know you want to talk about arms, so I'm just going to jump in. I mean, on arms supply, I think many of us have been pretty frustrated that conservatives criticized the Biden administration quite correctly and quite vociferously for withholding arms that Ukraine needed to stay in the fight and actually beat the Russians. That was a Republican critique of the Biden administration's policy. And there are officials in the Trump administration who have sustained that Biden policy of making Ukraine fight with one hand tied behind its back. I think that's very frustrating. I think the President of the United States, frankly, has been undercut by that. He would be in a stronger position. He would have more leverage if his Pentagon and other appointees had given the Ukrainians the weapons systems that they needed to give Russia enough of a black eye that Putin saw an interest in negotiating an end to the war. And I think it's frustrating. Keith Kellogg has spoken to this. The president's special envoy for Ukraine has said very directly, there are people in this administration undercutting the president by not giving the Ukrainians weapons that we agree they need to have to help them achieve battlefield superiority.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Let me just ask you a couple of things that are in the news. We're hearing about Tomahawk. We'll get to tariffs and sanctions in just a second. We're hearing about Tomahawk missiles that the president is considering allowing the Ukrainians presumably to buy and the Europeans to pay for it. Are you tracking this, and does this seem right?
Yes. I mean, I worry anytime that presidents are doing like a Lyndon Johnson style, I personally need to approve every weapons system, right? That's how you get into kind of Vietnam style incrementalism, where you have civilians micromanaging what military leaders probably know best. So again, my sense is that we should be giving the Ukrainians what they need to defend themselves. And in some cases, that's going to involve weapons that can strike into Russia. Because just like we learned in Afghanistan, as long as the Taliban had a rear supply base in Pakistan, we couldn't beat them, right? As long as Russian forces enjoy sanctuary to attack Ukraine, the Russian attacks on Ukraine, the missiles in particular, and some of the drones and hypersonic, the glide bombs, they are being launched over Russian territory. It's not as if, and so they're doing long-range fires from Russian territory. And successive U.S. administrations now have prevented the Ukrainians from fighting back against the source of those attacks. Ukraine can never win, and American taxpayers are going to be stuck in a forever war if that's our strategy. So our strategy should change. If we're serious about imposing a peace and raising the cost to Putin, we should help Ukraine do what it needs to take on those attacks, again, in self-defense, to counter those strikes very precisely. And American weapons, including the Tomahawks, are the key to doing that.
Okay, great. Now, have you heard of any other weapon systems that have been denied? I totally agree with you that the Biden administration piecemealed out such assistance, and we all criticized that heartily. Is there any other weapon system you've heard about in your travels that the Ukrainians really need right now?
I mean, I think they need a little more of everything. Patriots, ATACMS, the whole suite, HIMARS, right? I'm not a weapons expert, but they need a little bit more of everything. And the good news for your listeners is that America, in many cases, has been able to revitalize our own defense industrial base and upgrade the weapons supplies for U.S. forces by sending Ukraine older equipment. We have taken advantage, making lemonade out of lemons, the need to help Ukraine defend itself, to actually enhance and expand our own military capabilities, which will be quite valuable in the event of a conflict with China rather, in the Indo-Pacific. The Ukraine war has been able to stimulate U.S. defense production and focus attention on its deficiencies in a way that ultimately historians will judge will help us uphold deterrence in Asia. So that's a win. It also, I think, would be quite valuable to show America's enemies, not just in Russia, but beyond, including in China, what a country like Ukraine can do with some of our best systems, including to help deter Xi Jinping from thinking he can do to Taiwan what Vladimir Putin tried to do in Ukraine, which is to swallow it, right? We should make Ukraine a model for the fact that authoritarian aggression does not pay. And America's enemies are better holding their fire than wading into a conflict that it turns out they cannot win.
Yeah, great. All right, let's move over to tariffs and sanctions. What's your sense of where we are right now? We've heard the president talk about tariffs on India because they're importing Russian oil and gas. Have those tariffs been levied? Or where are we in President Trump's journey on the imposition of sanctions or tariffs to try and condition Vladimir Putin to make concessions at the negotiating table?
So I don't think we've done enough. And I think in tariffing India, we're actually shooting at the wrong target. China is the top importer of Russian energy, and we are not sanctioning and tariffing China to the extent that we are sanctioning and tariffing India.
So why do you think that is?
I think there is a logic which I think is misplaced in the Trump administration that India is kind of a softer target. and that we could make kind of a demonstration effect of India. But actually, it's hardened the Indians' position. It's undercut America's ability to work with India to balance China and manage the challenge of Chinese power, which is the whole logic of the U.S.-India relationship. So I don't understand why we're not primarily targeting China, who is the primary enabler of Putin's war against Ukraine. I also don't understand why there are still so many sanctions and other tools that we have not imposed on Russia. I mean, how can we have a tougher policy on India, who is just buying some cheap Russian oil, than we do on Russia, which is the aggressor and the source of all of this bloodshed and death and cost? So that's frustrating. I don't think it's going to play out effectively. I mean, the most effective thing we could do, Michael, is pass this congressional bill sponsored by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the Senate, Brian Fitzpatrick and his colleagues in the House. In the Senate, you got 85 senators out of 100 on this bill. 85 senators don't agree on anything these days, but they agree on huge sanctions and tariffs on the countries enabling Putin's war machine, starting with China. The other thing we should do, there are $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets sitting in mainly European banks. We should seize them and use them to arm Ukraine and reconstruct Ukraine. I actually don't think American taxpayers should be on the hook at a time when Russian assets could fund some of these expenses. This would also be a great demonstration effect, again, for China, which has a lot of overseas assets and holdings, to demonstrate that, hey, if you conduct a war of aggression against an American friend or ally, we are going to seize your international assets, and there's going to be a huge cost to your economy, a permanent loss to your economy. That's a form of economic deterrence that might actually prevent future wars. And again, I would rather do anything to uphold deterrence and prevent future bloodshed and lives and treasure, particularly American.
So let's stipulate, let's say the weapons aperture is opened, even if the Europeans are paying for it. We're supplying what they need in terms of long-range strike capability, not just the weapons, but the intelligence so that they can hit it. And if, let's say he steps up the tariffs and even does something on China, what do you think this delivers us? Is this enough to get Vladimir Putin to negotiate in a serious way? How do you? What's the end game here?
So Putin is obviously very ideologically committed to conquering Ukraine, even though he's not succeeding in doing that. I think we simply have to change the cost-benefit calculus for him to the point where it's impossible for him to sustain his war of aggression without grave risks to his own position of power inside Russia. That means using all these economic and financial sanctions instruments that we have withheld to essentially crush the Russian economy, to get him to a point where he has no other outcome but to cease fire, literally to seize fire and negotiate terms. It's funny because it feels like the President of the United States has made quite a good faith effort to try to meet Putin in the middle in an effort to achieve a diplomatic solution. Putin has demonstrated no interest in meeting in the middle. So that to me means he thinks he can sustain the current situation. We have to make it unsustainable. He's got to get to a point where the current situation is unsustainable for him because his country and his economy are facing some form of collapse. We have the instruments to do that. They're non-military instruments. They're economic and financial instruments. I think we should deploy them. There is also, however, an argument, a logic in your question, Michael, which is that maybe there's nothing that will get Putin to give up on his quest to conquer the former Soviet empire, that he's just so committed to that as an old Soviet KGB spy. And in that case, we have to just support Ukraine, work with the Europeans to create this drone wall, create a very robust NATO posture so that the Russian army can never get any further, right? It can never attack the Baltic states. It can never attack Poland or another core American ally. And even if this war ends like the Korean War did in 1953, it wasn't settled. There's no peace treaty, right? It's a frozen conflict. Both the armies basically froze in place on the Korean Peninsula in 1953. That is one scenario for how this war ends. And then look what happened in Korea. South Korea became one of the richest and most successful countries and economies in the world. North Korea is one of the poorest and most backward countries in the world. Maybe Ukraine is the South Korea of Europe, and that's the outcome here. And American and European troops combined with the Ukraine, the best fighting army in NATO, other than the US, maybe they just hold the line until Russia changes, until Russia has a leader that does not think conquering its neighbors is a thing, right? And that's not a satisfactory outcome, but that is another possible outcome.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Dan Twining.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that the Russians have come to the table, and let's go and look at the Ukrainian thought process. Up until around Alaska, we were talking a lot about security assurances. The ultimate security assurance for Ukraine, presumably, would be entry into NATO. But for a lot of reasons, that's not really in the offing anytime soon. What's the next best security assurance to the Ukrainians that might cause them to enter into some sort of ceasefire agreement with Russia?
So one is EU membership. It doesn't come with a security guarantee, but Ukraine is on kind of a faster track to join the EU. That's the Europeans who have the lead there. But that just locks Ukraine into kind of a Western orbit and really helps spike its economy. I think that is going to happen, that Ukraine has proven that it's a valuable European ally and a European nation fighting for the values of the West, right? The values of freedom. That's what Ukrainians are fighting for. So EU membership is one. Two is just an assured Western supply of arms and equipment to Ukraine. That doesn't, again, mean U.S. taxpayers are paying for a forever war. It's the opposite. It's that to sustain any kind of peace, any kind of ceasefire, any kind of settlement, even if it's just a frozen one, Ukraine is so robust that Russia is not going to attack it again, right? That Russia has learned its lesson. Ukraine has gotten stronger. Ukraine has assured arms flow from the West and high technology and intelligence sharing so that it can defend whatever its borders end up being at the end of this conflict. There are also examples, though, Michael. I mean, Germany came into NATO, West Germany, when it was a divided country. The fact that Russia is occupying just under 20% of Ukrainian territory doesn't mean that you couldn't bring the rest of Ukraine into Europe, right, into NATO. Just like we brought West Germany into NATO, even though East Germany was occupied by the Soviet army. So there are various scenarios here. I think the one thing everybody's learned from history is that, as you remember, in 1994, the U.S. and France and Germany and Britain gave Ukraine basically an oral commitment, a verbal undertaking in the Budapest Memorandum that we would support Ukraine's security in return for its giving up its nuclear weapons. It had nuclear weapons as a holdover from the Soviet era. That Budapest Memorandum wasn't worth anything because the Russian army then invaded in 2022, first in 2014 and then in 2022, and those Western allies did not do a whole lot. Particularly under President Obama, actually, the U.S. did about nothing. We wouldn't even send Ukraine defensive weapons. It wasn't until President Trump took office in 2017 that the U.S. actually sent defensive weapons to Ukraine. So for 3 years under President Obama, the U.S. refused to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons, which is actually mind-boggling in retrospect. So the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Europeans are not going to make the mistake again of thinking just a set of verbal guarantees is sufficient, because Putin will see right through that.
Just to go back in history for a second, the Budapest Memorandum, I mean, this is amazing. We didn't do anything, but we actually got something tangible out of the Ukrainians. Was there any debate whatsoever? Did anybody step forward at the time and say, by God, we have made some solemn commitments to this country and we need to step up?
I don't think so. America had won the Cold War. The Soviet Empire had collapsed without a shot being fired. The Soviet citizens had essentially freed themselves, right? First, behind the Iron Curtain, the satellite nations had risen up peacefully, largely. And then in Russia itself, the Soviet Communist Party was deposed at the hands of its own citizens. So I think you remember 1994. There was a mood that America essentially had no great power competition, that we were the sole superpower. And also, frankly, I think we always underestimate as Americans that we make these commitments. I remember us telling friends in Afghanistan we would be with them forever, right? And then President Biden did that disastrous withdrawal, that America does have a history of going in big and then going home, right? So I'm afraid that is part of what happened in Ukraine. But another interesting thing happened in Ukraine, which is that its political evolution, Michael, took a totally different turn from what happened politically in Moscow. In Ukraine, they had an Orange Revolution in 2004, a kind of peaceful citizen-led uprising against corrupt kind of pro-Russian leaders. And then again in 2014, in the Euromaidan mass movement, peaceful people power protest, they had another uprising. The pro-Russian leader of Ukraine, very corrupt guy named Yanukovych, at the time literally fled to Moscow like he was a foreign agent when his own people chased him out of power peacefully. So Ukrainians have spent the last few decades fighting to build a future of freedom in a country that still has deficits for sure, but is increasingly democratic, has free elections, is responsive to its citizens. Russia has become a despotism, right? It's become a tyranny under Putin. And so you have one-man rule in Moscow. It's kind of the opposite of what you have in Ukraine. I was in Ukraine in 2019 with the International Republican Institute leading an election observation mission, and we watched Zelensky get elected, right? He came out of the blue. He wasn't a politician, but he had this momentum and energy for change against the old Ukrainian establishment. And so Putin also watched this and thought, wow, the Ukrainians, they keep having these street revolutions. They keep electing, different leaders peacefully. They keep throwing their old politicians out of office through elections. If that happens in Russia, I'm finished, right? So Putin is very threatened by the idea of democracy in Ukraine, by the idea of Ukrainians charting his own destiny. If that happens in Russia, there's no future for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into this report by the McCain Institute Russia Task Force that, as I understand it, you headed the effort. And it's called Principles for U.S.-Russia Relations After Ukraine. Can you tell us how this came about and give us the general conclusion that was made?
Thank you. So thanks for being part of our conversations there, Michael, of our discussions. Basically, we set this up early this year. We understood that the president of the United States, new president, President Trump, was looking to negotiate a peace. And we were trying to figure out what kind of policy would you construct? What kind of recommendations could we make as friendly national security conservatives on the outside to help bring about a sustainable peace? The focus was not on the specifics of a Ukraine negotiation. The focus was more on what did the U.S. need to do to make sure that Russia never again invaded and tried to occupy a neighbor, and never again challenged the fundamental national security interests of the United States. So the report outlines a series of recommendations, some of which we've discussed: more arms supply, stronger use of financial and economic tools and sanctions, but also highlights the connectivity between China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, try to break up this axis of aggression, as we called it, as well as how the U.S. could use, frankly, soft power instruments, not just hard power tools, but instruments of diplomacy, instruments of economic tradecraft, instruments of support for democracy and broadcasting, to really put Putin back in his box, to put him on the defensive, so that Europe is not his for the taking and U.S. national security is upheld. So the report lays out a set of policy recommendations, both for helping bring about a peaceful resolution in Ukraine that upholds our national security interests, but also to put Russia in a position where it's never again going to launch a war of aggression that threatens the United States and our NATO allies.
So let's talk about how the report talks about Putin himself. The man, more or less, is the regime. First, is there any scenario, and I guess you did say earlier that maybe sanctions can condition Putin to maybe deal, but outside of that scenario, is anything likely to be a long, sustained peace as long as Vladimir Putin remains in office?
I mean, I would like to think so. I would like to think that he's rational enough to understand when he's beaten, when his strategy has not succeeded. We saw the Prigozhin affair, where one of his former close lieutenants really was criticizing Putin's conduct of the war and ended up leading essentially a military march towards Moscow, which was ultimately diffused before Prigozhin lost his life or was murdered by the Putin regime. But so there was an internal rebellion that came about due to criticism of Putin from one of his own henchmen on the failures of the war. There's a scenario like that could happen. I think it's more likely that Putin wants to remain in power, even if that means not conquering Ukraine. That means doing some kind of deal. That, to me, means imposing terms on him that make it essentially impossible for him to resist doing some kind of deal to end the war, rather than just raging a forever conflict. So we should be using all of those instruments, those financial and economic instruments, to put pressure on him very directly. The report also argues that we should be using some of our cyber and soft power capabilities to expose his corruption, to expose, frankly, the failings of the Ukraine war. In Russia, there's a lot of propaganda about how successful this campaign is, how NATO was actually the aggressor that attacked Russia. I mean, it's Orwellian, kind of the opposite of the truth. But to expose more for Russian citizens the true costs of this war, that Putin has led them into a ditch, and that Russian greatness is not a product of conquering its neighbors, right? That Putin is an obstacle between a more prosperous and successful Russia and what they've currently got.
Dan, along those lines, you, in the task force report, talked about a bad peace in Ukraine. What does that mean? Is that a mere ceasefire where Ukraine seemingly is under pressure to give up territory? Tell us what a bad peace looks like.
A bad peace is the kind of peace that Putin would like, where we essentially stop the fighting in real time, but he pays no price. All sanctions are lifted. He's able to sell energy again to the world. Europe and American companies go back and invest in Russia. All of that has stopped and is frozen or suspended or canceled. Putin uses that period basically to rearm, to freshen up his military, to recruit new soldiers, to buy more equipment with all the proceeds coming in from international trade and investment revenues. And then he relaunches the war from a stronger position. And he relaunches the war possibly not simply against Ukraine, but it could be against one of the Baltic nations or Poland, right? So a bad peace is one that basically takes Putin at his word. And a bad peace would also involve possibly NATO forces pulling back. You know, Putin's argument is that American forces should not be deployed on the territory of any former Soviet country in Europe. That means Poland, that means East Germany, that means Romania, that means the Baltic nations. He wants to make it easier for him and Russia to attack NATO allies by pulling American forces out of there. So we should not take him at his word. We should understand his game. He wants to make Europe less defensible, and he wants to make Ukraine weak. A bad peace would also involve, he wants Ukraine to be neutral. He wants the Ukrainian military to be disbanded. He wants Ukraine never to join NATO or the EU. He wants to essentially Finlandize Ukraine by neutering its political choices of its own citizens. So that kind of bad peace would actually make World War III more likely. It would make it more likely that President Trump or a future American president would have to make a very hard call about sending possibly Americans into battle to defend NATO, because we had not made a good peace, a peace through strength, the kind of peace that Ronald Reagan would have made, right? That preserves our equities and makes sure that Russia is never again in a position to threaten or attack the U.S. or our allies.
Great. Dan, we've talked a lot about the Europeans, and I think you used the term earlier that they were something to the offense of maybe they're scared straight now. Maybe they're shocked to their senses, I think is what you said. How serious should we take the Europeans when they say they are spending more on their own national defense? Because there's skeptics out there that say, well, you know what? This won't have any effect for many years. Some of it is gimmicky because it just spends on infrastructure and not actually military goods. What's your sense of this?
The Europeans really have stepped up. Germany is going to have the fourth largest military budget in the world in a matter of years. The last time that happened, circumstances were different, and the Germans were on the other side. So this is a good news story now. But the Europeans can't do it by themselves, right? Europeans are still divided within Europe. Europeans still have publics who like that peace dividend. They like all those social benefits. The U.S., by staying committed in Europe, including by maintaining our military presence and continuing our military support for Ukraine, can help give Europeans the confidence to do more and to carry their weight within the alliance. For the first time this past year, European assistance to Ukraine surpassed American assistance to Ukraine. It's quite amazing, but for the first few years of the Ukraine war, America was providing more total assistance, military and economic, than Europe was. And that's really changed. So the Europeans are stepping up. They have stepped up, but it's going to take them time. These are countries that were pacified, right? A lot of these countries after World War II did not rebuild their militaries. At U.S. urging, they focused on peace and building businesses and building social safety nets. So we spent many decades helping to protect and secure Europe. And by the way, those were the most successful and peaceful decades in Europe's long history. The longest period of peace in Europe since the collapse of the Roman Empire happened over the period between, say, 1945 and 2022. That peace was incomplete because the Soviet army occupied half of Europe until 1989. But when the Soviet Empire collapsed, Europe, NATO, the EU expanded. Europeans have never known this kind of peace and prosperity, and that's been a great benefit to the United States. So our national security interest remains in a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. That requires ending the Ukraine war in a way that upholds freedom and American core interests and making sure that Russia can never do it again. That's actually a lot cheaper than fighting, right? Deploying American forces in Europe in peacetime to help sustain stability is a lot cheaper than fighting a war.
So, Dan, sometimes when I'm making the case on behalf of Ukraine, and I mention a counterfactual. If the Russians had raped and pillaged their way westward, they would threaten NATO. And sometimes I get a lot of skepticism on that point, that no, that's definitely not the case, or they would have stopped at the border. They're not stupid. What is your assessment? Was Putin just trying to bring or ensure that Ukraine remained in his sphere of influence, or do you think he wanted to really threaten NATO?
Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Empire. Russia has not simply intervened in Ukraine. They invaded Georgia in 2008. They conquered Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. They intervened in Syria in the Syrian civil war in 2015. Assad would have fallen in 2015, not last year, if he hadn't had battlefield reinforcement from Russia. They then reinvaded Ukraine in 2022. Russia would like to conquer Moldova. They've done gross election and political interference in that country. They've had pro-Putin candidates they've supported in that country who have lost elections, but who wanted to pull Moldova back towards Russia. So he is working across the board to try to reestablish the Russian Empire. And he is also, you can take him at his word. Look at his joint declaration with Xi Jinping right around the time of the Beijing Olympics, just weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022. Their joint declaration, which your listeners can Google and read, sketches out a vision of a world in which might makes right, in which American leadership and American values are kneecapped, in which authoritarians are making the political weather around the world. That essentially Putin envisages a world of spheres of influence in which he owns much of Europe, Xi Jinping controls Asia, and the U.S. is isolated in the Western Hemisphere. That's not a world that's safe for Americans to live in. That's not a world that is going to secure our prosperity or our freedom. So take him at his word. He has very great ambitions. He said the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And he sees himself as a kind of Russian czar who's going to reestablish the Russian Empire. This is a problem for the United States. We have real interests in making sure that he does not succeed.
All right, I'm about to wrap up here with you, but before we get there, let me just press you on this a little bit. So maybe that was Putin's goal. Maybe he wanted to take over Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. But now, people like us argue that by helping Ukraine, we have virtually exhausted the Russian war machine. Sure, they've retooled a bit of their economy, but even as you said at the outset, they have really hamstrung themselves for future growth. And now they've destroyed a generation of young people, 1 million casualties. Now, is Russia so weak and feckless that we should just worry about them less?
No, because Russia is using not simply military instruments. It is using political and information warfare against the United States in Europe, in Africa, in South America. They are intervening maliciously in countries' politics and in their elections. I was just in West Africa last week, Michael. The Russians are supporting all these coup governments in the Sahel in West Africa who are highly anti-American. So Russia's goal, Putin's goal rather, is to weaken American power and leadership. American admirals and generals have attested to this. I would refer your listeners to General Chris Cavoli's testimony to the House Armed Services Committee in April this year, where he lays out very clearly that Putin wants to diminish and weaken American power and American leadership in the world. That is his fundamental objective. And he may be failing in Ukraine on the battlefield, but they are putting real points on the board in the global south and elsewhere through forms of malicious political and information interference campaigns. So Putin is not a friend of the United States. His interests are opposed to ours. And again, we've got to go back to peace through strength. The Republican Party platform at President Trump's 2024 convention in Milwaukee made very clear that peace through strength is the policy of the President of the United States and the Republican Party that currently governs the United States. And that means standing up to Putin, not doing a bad deal, and making sure that fundamentally our interests and our values prevail at the end of the day, not Vladimir Putin's.
Okay, Dan, last question. Let me ask you to put on or peer into a crystal ball. If I pressed you here, what does this look like in the coming year? Does it evolve into a frozen conflict where these two fight themselves to a virtual standstill, where we might be going anyway, and these lines just stay there? Do we continue like maybe we were a few months ago with a lot of muddle, where the Russians seem to make some incremental gains here and there, but nothing decisive? In other words, a more active battlefield, whereas frozen conflict is, by its own terms, less activity going on. And I'll throw out there, do you see a negotiated settlement and, so therefore some sort of ceasefire or peace? You don't have to be limited to those three, but that's just sort of illustrative of what I see people mentioning for an outcome.
So I think you nailed it. It could be any one of those outcomes. I mean, I would just say the President of the United States wants a deal to end the war. And I think, he correctly understands that this will be part of his legacy. He sees himself as a deal maker and a peacemaker. And I think he and his team would be very frustrated if Putin is so intransigent as to resist any kind of negotiation or any kind of deal making. I can see the frozen conflict scenario. I can also see just a continuing grind, right? I hope if it's a continuing grind, we will continue to give Ukraine to really ramp up the supplies it needs to stay in the fight. Obviously, Europe is and will be doing more. But really fundamentally, Putin, by not winning, in some ways has already lost, right? He made these messianic claims that Ukraine was going to be a 72-hour operation. Essentially, Ukrainians would welcome Russian forces. Only exactly the opposite has been the case. So Putin, I think Ukraine has already secured a victory by not losing. NATO is getting stronger. NATO has enlarged. I used to spend a lot of time in Sweden in my last job. Swedes would always say, we'll never be part of NATO. Now Sweden is in NATO. Finland is in NATO, right? These are countries that were not in the alliance. So the alliance is stronger. The defense industrial base in Europe and the U.S. is growing, despite continuing shortcomings and problems. Hopefully the war has focused the attention of the United States Congress on the fact that the world is getting more dangerous, not less. And this is a really bad time to have the lowest defense budget as a percentage of GDP since 1940. America has the lowest defense budget as a percentage of its economy since 1940. And we know how that played out, right? Weakness is provocative. So let's invest in our national security. Let's also help Ukraine stay in the fight. Let's use these economic and financial tools to try to bring Putin to the negotiating table to actually make compromises and concessions. And I still think we have the toolkit to do that if we focus in on it.
Dan Twining, president of the International Republican Institute, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Great to be with you, Michael. Really appreciate the show and appreciate what you do.
That was Dan Twining. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.